A Psychological Study of Sycophancy by L. Clark M.D. Part 2. For the moment let us note merely that with the father Dick's cravings meet with frustration. In his attitudes of investigation the father breaks down the son's protections. He was the first to cross him, and he is still doing it. He refuses him the amount of money the boy feels entitled to and needs. That is, he refuses to be the means by which he may pile up narcissistic gratification, ornaments, luxuries, pleasures, etc. Father is unwilling to work all year around, to give himself exclusively to the process of providing while Dick plays the role of receiving, of taking in what father has made, nursing relationship. Finally, the father tells him to work for what he gets, urging him to give up his oral traits and to meet the reality principle. He is taking the stand that the son must no longer magically receive gratification, but that he must now begin to give himself to objects in the outer world. Could we say that he is weaning him? The material shows, further, that the general outcome of father's attitude towards him is an ambivalent feeling on Dick's part. He admires and loves the father who is big heart, the father who does things for him, who provides some degree of satisfaction for his cravings. But he bitterly hates the father who seems small and mean, the father who expects him to project into reality. What a striking similarity to the reactions of the child towards the good mother and the bad mother in early infancy. It may be there is something really dynamic in this similarity. We have noted previously that Dick rarely gives any material regarding his mother. Could this be because his dependent relationship with her is now so deeply in the background, repressed, that it no longer is an obvious emotional issue? Seemingly when mother could no longer gratify his cravings, he displaced the relationship out onto father and objects in the outer world which could supply his needs. When reality imposes restrictions, the conflict of the weaning is again fought, on a different battleground but for the same stakes. To Dick, though, it seems like a new struggle. It is not mother who is cutting him away from his narcissistic protections, it is father. It is not mother who has the means to supply him, it is father. Therefore, his emotional concern lies in the relationship with father, although, according to our formulation, the unconscious basis for his feelings is at the level of the mother relationship. Let us not forget, however, that in addition to love and hate for the father, he has also shown fear. Much of the analytic material deals with this feeling, either towards father directly or towards those who are father substitutes. He has spoken of often being afraid to go home, because of the disapproving attitudes father might take. There was the fear to face father or to confide in him about his troubles. On the surface, we might interpret this as the fear of the weak ego at the prospect of losing love. Possibly a deeper analysis, however, would demonstrate that it is Dick's own repressed sadism, hostility towards the father, which makes him fear reprisals. At least we may say that thus far the analysis has indicated a lack of freedom and friendliness of his attitude towards the father and towards authority. We should expect, then, that this condition would be reflected in Dick's super-ego. The analytic material has shown that he often castigates himself severely for his misdeeds. Frequently he feels that if he were given a good talking to every day, it might do him some good. On one occasion he remarked, "The longer I stay here, the more I think what a useless person I have been since I was born." The following material is characteristic, also. I wonder if it was a form of vanity to believe I could always get out of trouble. I know I've been wrong. I can say, don't do such things, but that fails. I know I have been wrong, but haven't bothered about it. Father told me if I knew what people thought of such a man as I am, I'd go and hide my face in the woods, but no one has ever said anything about it. People may talk behind my back but I have friends who praise me. Our impression of material of this sort is that Dick in taking over the parental attitudes to form his superego, has needed to emphasize the prohibitory and condemnatory elements. The ego is too weak to control the instinctive demands in accordance with reality. Yet it is afraid to guide them to full satisfaction. It needs the support of strength from the outside. The superego contributes its power, but only on the side of a reality which requires renunciation. The ego cannot sustain such a loss, for it involves the denial of narcissistic needs. As we have seen, his superego scolds him, condemns him as a useless person, and says, "Don't do such things," but the ego is unable to do anything about it. Apparently it takes shelter in the constant faith that everything will turn out all right, that he will always be able to get out of trouble. Here again it is seemingly the magic omnipotence, born out of the complete gratification in the mother identification, which provides the defense against a critical reality. Even if the superego, father, continually chides him bitterly with the disapproving attitudes of the outer world, there are always friends who can feed his narcissism, praise him, as a protection. His superego seems to go on condemning and punishing him with a sense of guilt. The ego meekly receives the scolding, without accepting its principle, it protects itself by not meeting reality. We cannot really get a clear understanding of the formation of Dick's superego until we have considered his disposal of the Oedipus situation. Speculations on this will have to depend on the material he has given regarding his later sex life. Thought I'd like to be married to a girl who is educated, compare her with other girls I know, now that's wrong, trying to find a perfect person. It's not right for me to try to demand they come my way. I always wondered what my mother thought of the girls I knew. I want her to approve of my girlfriends, want them to be asked to our home. As to sex life, have always been reticent, a fear, mother and father, never spoke of that part of my life. Told father one day, he couldn't speak to me afterwards. I say I'm not bothered, but probably I am, maybe it's so crammed down it can't help me. I know I'm not demonstrative, cold. Never seeking intercourse unless, tight, peculiar, satisfied without much of that life. No normal life for me. Been living all wrong I guess, must have gone into other satisfactions, fun, good times, but always kept away from any real sex experiences unless I drank. Never knew it meant so much. At another time he refers to his love for a particular girl. It's not a burning passion, but an understanding affection. I've told her she was not as active as other girls I knew, didn't kiss me or make a fuss. She said, "Is that necessary?" I see it's not. I still believe I love her, but I don't know. We infer from this that there is the beginning of a slight heterosexual urge, although it apparently is highly diluted with narcissistic aims. Desiring the girl to be active, make a fuss, etc. Dick seems to recognize that in the object he is seeking perfection, and we might interpret this as a close holding to the mother ideal. We note that he feels it is wrong to make this object choice. May we conclude that the heterosexual object is so close to the mother image that the incest barrier is raised? Only when fear of the father, superego, is overcome by means of alcohol can he indulge in intercourse. If this is the true picture, it looks as if Dick had been unable to meet the Oedipus situation. We might say that there has been a quick repression of the usual incest impulses, without allowing a broadening in the choice of object. He seems to cling to mother as object, but the father in the Oedipus conflict forbids a relationship at that level. The weak ego, borrowing from father the strength to repress the Oedipus desires, erects a harshly dominating superego. The ego is blocked from living through the Oedipus conflict. Apparently it seeks to settle the issue by regressing to an earlier, narcissistic, stage of object choice, for we have noted his preference for married women who seem to play the part of the gentle mother. In such relationships the problem of adult sexuality can be laid aside, and satisfaction may come at the characteristic level of narcissism and oral ingestion, luxuries, receiving, etc. We refer again to the analytic notes for further hints regarding his sexuality. 2 days ago I wrote a letter to father and mother. Father hasn't written to me at all. He's having a good time. I'm here, nothing to do. I don't want to be the first one to make the start. I haven't written to him. I'm small and don't want to do anything about it. I like certain facial characteristics, especially eyes, man or woman, stir me. Here he describes a boy he likes, talks to him, wants to do things for such a boy, get him a job. Fear there may be something wrong about such a feeling of attraction. That's all I can tell you about it. I want my reaction to be normal, want to be natural. I'm always interested in people's reactions, to see whether mine are normal or not. I can't afford it but I buy music for Fred. I want him to like me better. I don't think it natural to be attracted by faces and voices, all my life long, it puzzles me, not right to be attracted by a man's looks. I yearn for companionship, maybe we will be good friends, come to my room, have a party together. In this chain of associations there is the hint of a strong homoerotic trend. Apparently father is one of the objects, for thoughts of father's inattentiveness are closely associated with attractions to men in general, and, from our understanding of the inverted Oedipus complex, we may assume he is the primary object. Dick's softness and lack of aggressiveness invariably give the impression of femininity. His general manner, as well as the subjective material he gives, might be translated as the desire to be attractive to father, men, and to do nice things for him in order that father shall be attentive. In this particular phase, while Dick often seems to be active towards men, the main impression is that he unconsciously wishes to arouse affection from the object, that he himself shall play the passive role. We are led to believe that, from his identification with mother, he attempts to play her part towards father as an object, that Dick's is a passive homoerotism. Not only in the material quoted but also in many other associations Dick gives indications that the overt homoerotic tendencies are sharply repressed. Since the erotic impulses towards father are frowned upon by father and by society in general, here again is the need for a powerfully dominating superego to aid the repression. Dick does not become homoerotic in the sense usually implied by popular terminology. Yet his attitudes, his manner, his general character, all speak of an accentuation of the homoerotic trend beyond that usually seen in the average person. That this tendency plays such a major role in his character formation, while the usual masculine heterosexual attributes, aggressiveness, power, forcefulness, etc., are mainly lacking, leads us to assume that at bottom the homoerotic trend is the stronger. It is a familiar observation that in the analysant's attitude towards analysis and towards the analyst may be found condensed representations of the whole range of his reactions. Dick seems to be no exception. There constantly appears in his material the desire to be told what to do about his problems, to have the analyst talk to him and give him some ready solution for the difficulty. Occasionally he voices a mild complaint, "I tell you these things, but you don't do anything about them." He would like to read about psychoanalysis or get to know how other people analyze, then, he feels, he would be able to get along better. Throughout it all he feels afraid to let himself expose his associations freely. All of this could be interpreted as part of the narcissistic aloofness and protectiveness. Yet, more definitely, it seems to express his wish to have the satisfying result given to him, rather than be required to give himself to the experience and work it out for himself. All of the oral character traits expressed in "getting something for nothing" seem to be represented in this attitude. Moreover, early in the analysis he began to show a marked antagonism against the sanatorium, a caustic rebelliousness against the way it was managed. His bitterness was expressed in sneering comments about the physician in charge, and in a cold contempt for the rules, especially the restrictions which were put on his own freedom. In the interests of analysis, he was asked to give up alcohol, to reduce his trips away from the place, and to refrain from intimate relations with any one particular person. "I've wondered if my impatience and troublemaking is due to stopping drinking and having my own way." This would seem to be the natural interpretation. His resistance is against the giving up of his narcissistic protections, against the loss of his magic omnipotence. The meeting of reality is one of the things analysis and the analyst stand for. We have no doubt that his resentment is actually against the latter, although his fear only allows him to deprecate those who are not present. Yet the summary of another characteristic session of analysis shows other feelings about the analyst. The material first indicated resistance and dependence on the analyst and on father. Next Dick spoke of his antagonism towards homoerotics, ladylike men, but he found, on further thought, that he likes to be with such people and is ashamed of it. He feels they like him, doesn't know why. They don't demand anything from him. He feels the analyst likes masculine men, so does father. Feels the analyst does not like the company he keeps, homoerotic men. Father seems to feel the same. Dick feels the analyst is too quick to judge. Next he indicated resistance against the reporting of his own homoerotic trend. Finally he remarked, "Part of me likes analysis, and that part keeps me here." First we note that the negative transference, projection of father antagonism onto analyst, is too strong for a free analysis of homoerotism. Apparently the analyst, the father, and Dick's superego are all equated, and all disapprove of homoerotic traits. Ladylike men would seem to be castrated fathers, fathers whose power and aggressive strength are missing, so that they become, to Dick, gentle, undemanding mothers. There is an attraction to them because the fear is reduced, and they give him love. Yet, in their softness and other homoerotic traits, they stand for the instinctive urges in this direction, on Dick's part. He is antagonistic because his superego is struggling fiercely to overcome his own homoerotic tendencies. His character is identified with theirs, therefore his superego denounces them just as it would denounce his own ego for allowing expression of his own homoerotic tendencies. The analyst not only represents the disapproving superego, but he also is in the position of father, with whom Dick instinctually would desire to have homoerotic relations. He would wish the analyst, father, to like, ladylike men, Dick himself, and it seems to be this attachment which holds him to the analysis. The ambivalence, then, apparently represents the swing of his feelings between a homoerotic attachment to the analyst, father, and a fear-laden hostility towards the analyst, superego. On one occasion his associations in analysis had prompted the analyst to interpret the general dependence and to suggest that its basis lay in the identification with mother and the oral fixation. The young man was willing to accept the formulation of his dependent attitudes on his parents, but seemed unwilling to agree to the deeper significance of this fact. After missing the next 2 sessions of analysis, his associations definitely showed a desire to give up analysis, so that he would have more money. Whereupon he failed to appear for 3 more appointments, and when he did come in, the following dream was reported. In a place like the cottage, where his own room is. Place smelled of skunk. Saw a skunk. Tried to get away by going to another room. I wondered how I could please him so he wouldn't do anything to me. Make him happy. It followed me. I talked to it. It stood on its hind legs, looked very pleasant but smelled terribly. I found that by breathing a certain way I could avoid the smell. I thought I had to get rid of it. I tried going in another room, and thought I had succeeded in escaping when the door would not close entirely, so he came in again. I woke up. Dick now laughs and says, I know what you are thinking. You would say that I think you, analyst, are the skunk. He vows that his feelings for the analyst are ones of respect and friendliness. In spite of his quick assurance to the contrary, or because of them, we can have little doubt that the analyst is represented by the skunk. The resistance to analysis, the attempts to avoid it, and the hostile attitude towards the analyst are all clearly indicated in the dream. It is as if Dick were saying, he, analyst, is a pleasant fellow, but what I get from him, odor, perhaps this is allied to taste and oral reception, is very disagreeable. We might translate this as representing Dick's liking for the analyst as a person, but his hostility towards him as one who cannot be drawn on to increase his magic omnipotence, one who asks him to face disagreeable reality, interpretations. To go further in our speculation, we assume that Dick dreamed the situation as he did because that is the way he wished it. In other words, the door does not close, because he Irishes the analyst, skunk, to follow him and be with him. Please him so he wouldn't do anything to me, might be taken, in its reverse, to mean that he wishes to bring about erotic relations with the analyst. Probably we may see the repressive influence of the superego, against such homoerotic impulses, in the remark, I thought I had to get rid of it, and also in the fact that Dick awoke at the point where the analyst, skunk, rejoined him. In the absence of free associations, other interpretations are, of course, just as valid as these. We feel, however, that in view of Dick's known characteristics, the above conclusions are reasonably justified. At least the dream may be cited as an illustration for our description of his ambivalence towards the analyst. Having sketched our provisional understanding of the case, we pause to review briefly the main factors. First, there seems to be a continuance in the unconscious of the original identification with mother. Allied to this are the oral and narcissistic needs, which are expressed in his character formation. Second, a strong homoerotic trend, of the passive type, is apparent, symbolically in the financial relationship with father, and more directly in Dick's personality as he engages socially with men and women. We have postulated, as the basis for this, the inability, because of the continued mother identification and the weak ego, to live through and finish the usual Oedipus conflict. Third, the outstanding antagonism against the father appears to be, not a part of the familiar Oedipus situation, but a sadistic hostility towards one who seems to deny Dick's oral, narcissistic, and homoerotic desires. Our fourth main point has been that the weak ego has had to take over a severe superego, in order to attain the power to repress instinctual demands. We observe, however, that just as between father and Dick, so between the superego and the ego, there is no free friendliness of cooperation. Instead, verbal chastisement is met with hostility, rebellion, and fear. The question arises, if Dick's irresponsible ways of living are to be regarded as symptoms, what purpose do they serve? Clearly they allow him to retain the magic, narcissistic, omnipotence associated with the breast relationship. As long as he can get something for nothing and assure himself that he will always find some way of getting out of trouble, he can cling to this infantile level. Moreover, he has frequently said of his transgressions, I threatened father that I would go out and borrow money. Or, all the things I have done against father, etc. Such expressions lead us to regard his dubious practices as serving to discharge sadistic feelings against the father. Finally, we may note that the symptoms not only provide disguised gratification but also offer a retreat from the painful or fearful aspects of reality. There may be other explanations for his continued irresponsibility. Among them, the following is suggested by the analytic material. He has occasionally reported feelings of anxiety about his parents, he has fantasied being suddenly called to them, to learn that they have been killed in an accident. Such sadistic thoughts, we should assume, are followed by a deep, unconscious sense of guilt. It is possible that he suffers in this way without being aware of the fact. The continued repetition of acts which, as he says, he knows are wrong would then offer a conscious reason for the guilt. He could accept the chastisement of his superego and momentarily atone for his guilty feelings. It is characteristic of Dick that he often misses a whole week or more of analysis, but he returns to beat himself severely for his waywardness and to wonder why the analyst does not treat him harshly. It may be that he unconsciously wishes to be punished for his escapades, in order that he may be relieved of the unconscious sense of guilt resulting from other sources. There is not sufficient material to establish this definitely, but we may recognize the possibility that the symptoms serve the above purpose. Since the oral needs seem to be the basis of the sadistic thoughts, however, we may still regard our previous summary as fundamentally valid. We are in a better position now to discuss what could be done about the young man's problems. Suppose he were placed under careful supervision, so that all of his irresponsible demands would be regularly refused and his borrowing and spending rigidly controlled. Let him see that society will not stand for his dubious practices. Let him be aware of all the punishment which will descend on him, unprotected, if he oversteps the bounds of straightforward dealing. Would this settle the difficulty? Clearly we may agree that such a restraining system would not take away the oral and narcissistic needs, it would not remove his sadistic impulses nor change the trend of his homoerotism. It would simply raise a barrier, a more powerful superego, against the expression of these impulses in real life. Experience tells us that the instinctive demands always find a way out. Even in the so-called normal person, the instincts find an outlet in various forms of activity, in accordance with the degree of development which the individual has attained. Is it not possible, however, that with barriers placed against his present unacceptable outlets, he might find other means of release more compatible with society? This turns us again to his potentialities. Certainly our study of his personality gives us little assurance that the ego is strong enough to meet reality as represented by the standards of society. On the contrary, our impression is that further blocking would result in a further retreat within a symptom formation which would more deeply disguise the gratification of his impulses. For example, it may be that the reason why he does not engage in homoerotic perversions is that the oral and narcissistic cravings, born out of the mother identification, receive satisfaction in the various expressions of his character traits, ingestion of magic power and omnipotence from the outer world. His superego blocks the path of discharge in the way of overt acts, the instincts find their outlet in disguised form. What would happen if this, too, were prohibited? We are familiar with the deep regressive satisfactions to oral and narcissistic cravings afforded in dipsomania. Dick's descriptions of depressed moods followed by periods of alcoholism suggest the potentiality for this disease formation. Moreover, in his attitude towards father, we may see not only homoerotic trends but also the shadowy formation of delusions of persecution, suggestive of paranoia. We might even speculate that his occasionally expressed fear that he will catch epilepsy represents the unconscious impulse towards some deeper form of regression. At least we may see, in general, the wraith-like leanings towards several types of narcissistic neurosis. Briefly, it can be explained that he does not turn to these disease processes, because his present reaction formations provide the needed satisfactions and retreats from reality. Possibly some one of the above diseases would afford him a way out, if his present means were blocked. Instead of restrictions, then, why not talk with him frankly, show him the error of his ways, and win him over to more responsible living? Such a procedure seems more reasonable, but could it be carried out? We feel that it really begs the question. If Dick's ego were strong enough sincerely to accept the attitudes of reality, he would not have his present difficulty. Moreover, the ego cannot be strengthened by being talked to and advised, it gains real power only by experiencing reality in its own way and forming its own convictions. Finally, if he is to be won over, we must assume that he would be able to make a sufficiently strong, friendly transference to the person who was influencing him. When we consider the deep resistance which is shown against an analyst who is mainly passive, there is some doubt that Dick's narcissism would long allow him to be accessible to an influence which would have to be active. Yet we must agree that possibly he could form an attachment which would be mainly narcissistic but which might eventually show some signs of objectivity. Perhaps by means of a friendly relationship he could come to a greater freedom between the ego and the superego. The superego might allow the ego to follow its own path of development and experiencing. The ego, on the other hand, might let itself be convinced of the soundness of the superego attitudes. In other words, the winning over process would have to be left entirely in Dick's hands. Direct influencing or moral teaching, however kind and friendly, would have to be given up. Dick's friend, instead of advising, would merely offer support and encouragement to the ego, as needed in the process of reality testing, until sufficient ego strength was developed to meet reality alone and find gratification in it. Analysis seems to attempt something of this sort. It allows Dick to bring to consciousness and to become aware of the repressed cravings which lie back of his reaction formations. The ego then faces the real problem of dependencies and needs, rather than the displaced difficulty of an environment which has to be slyly tricked. In re-experiencing and meeting the issues, with the friendly support of the analyst, he has the chance to gain power, both from self-knowledge and from closer contact with reality. Whatever change is made would be made at Dick's choice and at a speed in proportion to his new development. Actually, one probably cannot hope that his narcissistic character can ever be given up. Yet the ego might be able to gain sufficient strength so that it would allow the instincts a certain degree of objective discharge, a certain proportion of object libido merged with the narcissistic gratification. In this would come a closer approach to the reality principle and, with it, less need for the symptomatic retreats which we have noted as part of Dick's personality. It is but natural to inquire what influence, beneficial or otherwise, did the parents exert in such a dire predicament as shown here. The mother was weak in her ability to rear her son so that he would build up a strong sense of independence and resourcefulness. Whereas the father, semi-dependent upon his wife's income, did not set the best example for the boy to follow. No trifling advancement has been achieved in this case in that, for the first time in the young man's life, he is kept continuously employed in one position and at a time when, owing to the present depression, many of his co-workers have been laid off. Not only has he lived upon his earnings but he has repaid several $100s in debts during the 2 years that have elapsed since his analysis was discontinued. We may point out that such individuals appear for analysis only when they are impelled by some serious social or legal predicament, hence the very nature of the transference must of necessity be a negative one. Inasmuch as the negative transference is the final one necessary for any thoroughgoing analysis, its presence at the beginning is not so unfortunate as it might appear. Nor does an incomplete working through of the negative transference work the same degree of harm a purely positive one does. At any rate, the whole analysis, treated here only in part, clearly shows that some such analytic procedure offers a way to treat these social problems more advantageously than any method suggested up to the present time. In conclusion, we have here a type of libido arrest or fixation on the earliest, oral-erotic, phase of the maternal identification so that the patient has become a subject-homoerotic, one possessing too little object-homoerotism to feel the need of object cathexis, or any real desire to master reality, hence his attenuated power of transference. Such child men are most frequently encountered in dipsomanic and overt homoerotic types. Is it possible to convert the subject-homoerotic into an object-homoerotic by analytic procedure? This query is pertinent inasmuch as Hirschfeld has taught, and many follow his conclusions, that all homoerotics, repressed or overt, subject as well as object types are, physically as well as mentally, deeply engulfed in a fixed biologic pattern. Hence he holds that the homoerotism is too deeply organic or constitutional for any form of psychoanalytic procedure to radically modify it. Then, too, in his exposition there lies a sort of glorification of the homoerotic's physical and mental makeup. We agree with Freud and Ferenczi rather that neither of these contentions is true. In fact, Hirschfeld's general description of the homoerotic as a class applies only to the subject, homoerotic. The greater number of object homoerotics in many if not all instances contract a compulsion neurosis from the very nature of their social dilemma, and these in consequence either of a positive or a negative transference, or even under a narcissistic transference per se, are proper subjects for psychoanalytic treatment. As soon as the reaction formation of their compulsion has disappeared under analysis, many such remain for an analysis of the homoerotic onlage from which the compulsion has arisen. Thus we see that psychoanalysis is becoming increasingly useful in a large number of homoerotic types. Thanks to this procedure, it makes clearer the homoerotic class as a whole, and gives a raison d'etre which illuminates this whole field. We believe we have demonstrated the possibility of converting the subject, homoerotic into an object homoerotic, in part at least, in another study of homoerotism, and in a dipsomaniac, a summary of whose analytic histories will be given in another place. With this phase of narcissism reduced, or so altered that some object libido may be employed in analysis and the daily living, the issues brought forward in our thesis may, in future, be less discouraging than obtains at present. Obviously psychoanalysis is the only therapeutic agency at present to which we may look for a more hopeful prognosis in sycophancy as well as other social problems.